Do you want to say hi to everyone? Pippin says hi. What do you think? Should we tell them about the books we read in December? Should we do that? Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori. Today I am doing the final wrap-up video for 2024, and that is all the books that I read in December. I read 6 books in December and reread an old favorite, read a classic, read a new genre to me, and had a phenomenal time for my final reads of the year. The first book that I finished in December was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. I grew up watching all of the Jane Austen adaptations. I have seen them so many times I can probably quote them from start to finish, especially the 1990s Pride and Prejudice, the old Sense and Sensibility with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet, etc., etc. I can pretty much quote those from memory. However, despite that, and despite being a big Jane Austen story fan, I'd never actually finished one of her books, which felt a little bit like a crime. So I decided to start with Northanger Abbey, which is the first book that Jane Austen ever wrote, but it wasn't published officially until after her death. Northanger Abbey is actually a pretty short read, and it's a bit of a satire, and what's funny about it is Jane Austen is kind of making fun of a lot of her era's pop culture literature, which I thought was fantastic. She was taking a little bit of a jab at the Gothic romances of the time, and somehow still telling an incredibly compelling and fun story where you can see the foundation of the kind of character work and storytelling that would dominate the rest of her books that we all know and love, which was very cool. I'm really glad that I started with this because I knew very little about the story itself. I think this is one of the only books that I haven't seen an adaptation of. I wanted to go into Jane Austen's work with something that was newer to me so that I could have kind of a fresh experience with her storytelling. And Northanger Abbey is the story of a young woman named Catherine Morland who goes into town, into Bath, to kind of come out in society and to live with some family friends. And of course, she starts to make friends. She starts to gain the attention of several young men. And in typical Austen fashion, miscommunications and shenanigans ensue. Catherine as a protagonist, I actually really enjoyed. I think that she is an incredibly naive character and she believes way too much in the good of the people around her. But that opened a lot of doors to show the dangers of being a very naive young person in a world that is honestly really cutthroat despite all of the sparkling diamonds and fancy satin. So I really appreciated this. I really did love the satire of Austen kind of breaking that fourth wall throughout the story to give us her opinion on the pop culture of the day, or how she felt about novelists in general, or how she felt about her own heroine, which I love. I love that she did that. I'm not usually a big fan of breaking the fourth wall, but Jane Austen does it in such a tongue-in-cheek and delightful way that I really enjoyed it. Overall, this was a fantastic first Austen read for me, and I'm really looking forward to trying Persuasion next. After that, I went on a bookstore shopping trip with my friend Emily, and we decided that we wanted to go into Barnes & Noble and choose a book for each other from the genres that we both read most often. For me, of course, that was fantasy, so I was able to pick her out a fantasy read that I really hope she's enjoying. And she picked me a mystery thriller, and that was Those Empty Eyes by Charlie Donnelly. I had a really good time with this book. I don't have a lot of experience in the mystery thriller genre, and I hope to remedy that to some degree in 2025, but I felt like this was a really good step into that field. Charlie Donnelly is a fairly well-known author. He's written quite a few books, and this was the story of a young woman whose family is murdered and she is the only survivor. And society, because of the evidence and the way she was found, believes that she was the killer of her own family. And I felt like this book, while the murder mystery itself was really interesting and forefront in the story, obviously, the story is more about the way that society witch hunts and the way that society has this obsession with the gory details of crime and the way that assumptions can be so damaging and end up ruining someone's life for a really long time. And I think that the themes that he went for in this book really gripped me almost more than the murder mystery itself, because as our protagonist grows up under the shadow of trying to stay out of the public eye, she becomes entangled in another murder mystery that starts to bring back memories of the one that she was trying to leave behind in her past. It's a very quick read. I binged it within a couple of days, really enjoyed it. There were some things that I felt like were a little bit convenient, that the motives might have been a little bit, especially the ending. I wasn't sure how I felt about the motives of the perpetrator slash Z. And I don't know. There were some things. However, I had a really good time with this overall and am very excited to continue my journey into mystery and thriller. Next up, I finished Jingo by Terry Pratchett. My husband and I have been listening to the audiobooks of the City Watch series since May or June this last year, and I love this series so much. Jingo is the fourth book in the City Watch series, and basically an island rises up out of the middle of the sea, and two different nations claim it. And it's basically Terry Pratchett's exploration of how wars get started, how ridiculous they are, all the bureaucracy around it, etc., etc. And of course, at the heart is the hapless City Watch that always seems to be thrown into the middle of these ridiculous situations and just have to make the best with what they're given. Two of my absolute favorite characters in that motley crew, Nobbs and Fred Colon, had a lot of center stage time in this book, which made me incredibly happy. Their conversations about world, life, and the people in it just had me rolling so many times. I laugh more in these books, you guys, than anything I think I've ever read. And I'm so in love with this series at this point and with Terry Pratchett's writing. So the thing that I have noticed about the City Watch books so far, and I think Terry Pratchett's work in general from what I've read, is that the characters are very much the point of the story. There is a plot, but it does kind of just, it's a little bit amoeba-esque, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know that I could look at this and say, oh, here's the very specific linear plot, and it all, makes total logistical sense. But honestly, I don't care. Jingo was a little bit timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly in terms of the plot line, but the characters shone out loud and proud, and I loved every minute of it, and it was worth it for Colon and Nobbs alone. So once again, an amazing experience with another Discworld book, and I can't wait to keep moving in the series. And this is my obligatory mention that if you want to get into the City Watch books, please listen to the audiobooks narrated by John Culshaw, who is a British impressionist. They are absolutely phenomenal, and the way that I always recommend people experience these characters. After Jingo, I finished a book that I have been reading for 3 months. And usually when I say that, it's a book that's a little bit longer, but not in this case. This time, it took me 3 months to read The Black Company by Glenn Cook. This started off as a buddy read with my good friend Matt over at Matt on Books. And Glenn Cook has always been named as an influence for one of my favorite authors of all time, Steven Erikson, author of Malazan Book of the Fallen. So I was very excited to read this because I enjoy seeing the influences that my favorite authors enjoyed reading. And I can completely understand where the inspiration comes from. The Black Company is a unit of soldiers who are roped into fighting for the Lady. The Lady is this kind of demigod sort of magician who is ancient and very, very powerful. And while the magic system of this world is very present constantly, it's really about the soldiers and the boots on the ground. We're introduced to a motley crew of characters within the Black Company, but our protagonist for book 1 is Croker, who is the medic slash kind of historian of the Black Company. I don't know why it took me so long to get through this book, you guys. The first 2/3 of the Black Company dragged so hard for me, to the point where I was even waffling between a 2 and a 3 star rating for this book, because I could not follow the very seemingly disjointed and jarring time jumps. I don't mind sparse and straightforward writing. I actually enjoy it depending on this type of story that's being told, and certainly for a story like this, it was very appropriate. But I do also think there's something that feels too sparse, like almost like the reader's being kept out of the story. And that's where I found myself for most of The Black Company. Once I got to the final third, things really started picking up. I'd been with the characters long enough that I started appreciating the nuance a little bit more. But there were some things in this book that I just really didn't love and really struggled to finish the story, to be honest. I can completely understand why a lot of people love these characters. I'm gonna have the potentially hot take that I think that Cook and Erikson utilize a lot of the same elements in storytelling, but I think Erikson does it a lot better. Overall, I am really glad that I read this, and I did end up enjoying the story a lot more at the end than I was anticipating that I was going to, so that's definitely a plus. I don't know if I'm going to continue the series. I haven't decided yet. I may at some point, but I have a lot of things to read before I get to it. Next up, I finished another self-published fantasy blog off winner, Orconomics by J. Zachary Pike. I went into this book not really sure what to expect, if I'm being totally honest, because it is labeled as a fantasy satire, and satire isn't usually what I gravitate towards. That being said, Orconomics has been one of the biggest surprises for me this year because I absolutely loved this story. We follow Gorm Ingerson, who is a dwarf who was a hero in a very D&D style party of heroes in his younger days, and he was disgraced after he turned and ran from one of his final battles. So he kind of lives on the outskirts of society. He's an outcast, he's a drunkard, and he kind of gets blackmailed into a new group of heroes that are assigned a very dangerous mission. Now again, similar to Terry Pratchett's work, this story is told by someone who obviously has a lot of experience and love for the fantasy genre, and I would say video gaming and D&D role-playing games in general, because the collection of the group of heroes, the world building is so good and it's so funny. There's so many little funny isms in this book. And one of the things that he utilizes as a twist in the story is he really looks at the economics of hero work and what that would look like as a structure in society, and what kind of organizations and insurance policies and all of that kind of thing would crop up in a world that utilized heroes battling dungeons and bosses and all of that sort of thing. There were so many really good moments in this book. The sidekick of Gleebeck, who is a little goblin that Gorm saves at the very beginning of the book, was one of my favorite sidekick characters of the entire year. He is absolutely precious and must be protected at all costs. The one thing I will say about this book, for anybody who wants to go into it, is I do feel like the satire label is a little tiny bit misleading, because there is a good amount of humorous satire in the book, but Pike also delves into a lot of pretty heavy themes, and it's not a silly read, if that makes sense. It's actually very interesting. There's a lot of really good character work in here. One of the things that I would share for anybody looking to pick up this series, and this isn't really a spoiler because I'm not going to tell you who, but there is a character in Orconomics who struggles very heavily with self-harm, and the way it is described is quite intense. So I do want to throw that out there as just for awareness. If you do decide to pick up this book, I think that it's done very responsibly and pretty nuanced for the most part. I had a little bit of an issue with an aspect of how that was handled. I think overall, though, he does do a really good job weaving in those deeper, darker themes with the satire aspects of the book. Last but not least, in December, I finished out the year with my 100th read, and that was Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. This is book 2 in his Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I have not read this book for 13 years. It's hard to even explain my thoughts on this book because I've had such a long history with it, and it's been my favorite fantasy book for 13 years of my life. And rereading it again in a completely different stage of life, in a completely different headspace than I did the first time, was such a powerful experience. This book easily upheld its crown as my favorite book of all time, my favorite fantasy book of all time. And what Erikson manages to accomplish in this series is nothing short of miraculous. It is so vast in scope and yet manages to be so incredibly intimate and human at the same time. And I think that's really where the magic of this series is. And one of the things that I keep coming back to as I'm rereading the series is that I think the constant, overwhelming susurrus of voices on BookTube who say that this series is one of the most intimidating, it's so hard, it's so complex. I really don't feel like we're doing it any kind of service by telling everyone that, because it is complex. It's not hard. This isn't the kind of book that you need a PhD to read. This isn't the kind of series that you can't get into unless you're taking notes. I took notes this time and annotated, but it isn't the first time I've read the book. The first time I read the book, I just was swept along the tide of the characters. I loved the story. It ripped my heart out of my chest, stomped on it, and then kicked it to the curb, and I still haven't found it. If anyone ever finds it, let me know, because the second time that I read this, somewhere, wherever my heart was from the first time I read it, it was stomped on again. I've never read a book that impacted me the way this book has. Never. I've never come across another author who reaches the kind of profound levels of storytelling that Erikson does in Malazan. It's not a perfect book, and I'll be the first person to admit that. The plot is super meandery. There's a lot of things that can be hard to follow, but none of that takes away from what this book has meant to me and how incredibly powerful this story is. I can't wait to finish this series as soon as humanly possible, as soon as comfortably possible, I should say. This isn't a series you can rush through, which is one of the reasons why it took me from April to December to finally finish the book. But I loved reading this again. It's such a special book to me. It's the book that made me want to be an epic fantasy writer when I read it 13 years ago, and has set me on the path to writing my own epic fantasy series. So I'm still completely head over heels in love with this book. I cannot wait to keep reading Malazan and to finally reach the end of the series and have that whole experience finally under my belt. All right, guys, that is all the books that I read in December. Once again, I would love to know your reads from December down in the comments below. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like. I hope you're having a fantastic week. I hope if you celebrated the holidays that you had a wonderful holiday season and that you ate lots of good food and were surrounded by people who love you. I also want to say, though, that if that isn't what your holiday season looked like, I hope you know that the world is a better place with you in it and that you matter. I hope you have a great week. I hope you read some 5-star reads here in 2025, and I will see you in the next video.